So this morning, for those who sat through the morning sessions, one thing that really struck me as a casual observer of energy issues in the region on the peninsula was, just really how much of a point of transition that we are right now, whether it's when you're looking at the United States and the shifts that we'll see under the Donald Trump administration and views on fossil fuels, nuclear energy, et cetera. Or you look at the political uncertainty in the Republic of Korea, an opposition camp who during the previous administration of Moon Jae-in was somewhat opposed to nuclear energy, but yet a country that is where it remains an important part of their industrial capability. And of course, Japan still kind of recovering from years of challenges since the Fukushima plant. But we're at a period where a lot of the assumptions that go into how we view the nuclear industry and as related to that, nuclear cooperation between the three countries, either trilaterally or bilaterally between the United States and Japan, United States and Korea. We're at a point where having a deep discussion on where we are, where we're headed, is extremely helpful. And so, that's why I think in putting this together, CIS teed up this session and brought together some experts on the subject, experts not only on the specific technologies or areas of study, but the region and the countries involved. And so let me introduce briefly our panelists before we move into it. Ross Maskin-Bridger, serving as the Senior Director for Nuclear Materials Security at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. In his role, he works at the nexus of clean energy and security, leading efforts to strengthen nonproliferation norms, minimize inventories of weapons-usable nuclear materials, and promote solutions for nuclear waste. Prior to joining NTI in 2022, Ross served as a Senior Advisor for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy, and from 2016 to 2021 served as Energy Attaché at U.S. Embassy Tokyo and Director of the Department of Energy Japan office. He also worked at the National Nuclear Security Administration, where he was responsible for negotiating agreements and managing projects to remove weapons-usable nuclear material from vulnerable locations around the world. Thank you, Ross. And from Korea, Professor Yoo-ho Lee, who specializes in nuclear fuel materials, fuel performance modeling, reactor safety and design, and nuclear fuel cycle policy. He served as the General Secretary and Secretary of Public Relations of the Korean Nuclear Society. He is serving as the chair of the Committee of Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy on the preliminary feasibility study on advanced fuel technology development. Professor Lee earned his Bachelor's of Science from Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, or KAIST, in 2009. He has his master's and PhD in nuclear engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in 2011 and 2013, respectively. He currently serves as an associate professor in the Department of Nuclear Engineering at Seoul National University. And prior to joining SNU, he worked as an assistant professor at the Department of Nuclear Engineering at the University of New Mexico in the U.S. And then finally, but not leastly, Jane Nakano, who is here this morning chairing one of our panels, a senior fellow here with the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS. Her research interests include U.S. energy policy, energy geopolitics, global market and policy developments concerning natural gas, hydrogen, and nuclear energy, of course, and critical minerals, energy security and climate issues in the Asia-Pacific region. So I thought I'd take a little bit extra time on the introduction so you know the backgrounds and areas of expertise that they bring to the table. So what we decided to do would be have a panel where each speaker would speak for 5 to 10 minutes, looking at relatively the same issues, although narrowly focusing down on their individual areas of expertise, looking at questions of how nuclear energy will be viewed and seen and handled by the new Trump administration. What can we expect from President Trump's energy strategy? How does he view international cooperation? And how can counterparts such as the ROK in Japan use nuclear energy cooperation and demonstrate the value, as we saw in the last segment, and as we listened to the lunchtime speech by the senator on the importance of Alaska to Korea and Japan, how, and then throughout all this, where are opportunities for trilateral cooperation. So, Ross, tell us about the new Trump administration and what direction you might see nuclear energy heading under this new president.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sid. Thanks all of you for being here. I'm really happy to be a part of this panel. So looking at the new Trump administration, which is so fresh, and where they might come down on nuclear energy, I think there's a few clues that we can look to understand where we might be going, or where there are real opportunities for this administration to be going in ways that kind of fit within the framework that they have set up more broadly. So the first thing that I look at is where did the first Trump administration land on this? And so, and at this time I was at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, actually, and working on many of these nuclear energy issues. And there was a lot of support for nuclear energy. At home, there was support for the Vogtle project, so the completion of the last two commercial nuclear plants that were built in this country. There was a lot of support for small modular reactors and kind of building the next generation of technologies that we're looking at. So that's kind of the first thing I look at. Where was Trump 1.0? The second thing I kind of look at is, well, what has Donald Trump said or done related to nuclear energy more recently? And there's less of a body to look at there, but the last that I could find was, I think, some comments he made when he had his interview with Joe Rogan a few months back, in which he said that nuclear energy can be too big, too complex, and too expensive. So that sounds a little less encouraging on the nuclear energy front. However, then he also appointed Chris Wright, who was just confirmed as Secretary of Energy, who is fairly pragmatic person from what I understand, and certainly is well steeped in the nuclear field. And then finally, what I look at is, what overall is the Trump administration doing? What is their ethos? Not just on nuclear energy, but overall. And a big theme that I think we've seen over the last week and a half, since 2 weeks, has been move big and move now. So what does this mean for nuclear energy? So, in the United States, it's been a very challenging time for many decades, right? In this century, there's been only 3 nuclear power reactors built in this country. We now have a very busy marketplace with lots of different technologies being bandied about, and a lot of confusion over how we move forward. And I think some confusion and maybe even some conflation over the difference between nuclear research and science and nuclear deployment. And so I think that what kind of fits the mold more of the Trump administration is nuclear deployment. How can we get steel in the ground, and how can we move quickly? And so what I see is kind of looking for the quickest path for cost-effective nuclear deployment. I see kind of the use of the best, most cutting-edge existing technologies that we can get going now. And so this is, again, this difference between deployment and science. And science is very important. We ought to be doing it, but we can't confuse that with what can be actually deployed now. And so what can take advantage of existing supply chains, and maybe some of the more flirtations that we've had over the last few years with technologies that are more about kind of research and science, and I would put spent nuclear fuel reprocessing in this bin, that those are fine to continue to do some research on, but they're not ready for prime time. If we are going to be working on, steel in the ground, let's get going now, then really focusing on the best technologies that we have available today. And I think there's a lot of room for collaboration, in this area with our friends and allies, and certainly South Korea and Japan.
Well, before moving on to Yuho, you were attaché there in Tokyo, and so you had a good vision of what concretely took place between the two countries. What does the U.S. gain from that type of nuclear cooperation with a foreign country? What are we talking about here, and what do you think that would look like going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a whole lot to gain on a number of different fronts, just in terms of markets. So we could be working together to gain access to more markets than if we were just working alone. What I've seen in the past is, that there is kind of sentiments of collaboration, but when it comes to industry, there tends to be a little bit more protectionism. And so I've seen instances in the past where, instead of the U.S. and Japan working together to find ways to get a deal done, get a project in the ground that can benefit both, we end up competing with each other, and instead neither country gets anything. And so I think that there's a real opportunity to understand how collaboration can actually help us get a piece of the pie when otherwise we might not get anything. I also think there's opportunities in terms of energy security when we're looking at fuel supply. And so there's been a lot of discussion about kind of how to ensure that our fuel supply is secure as possible, that we're getting our resources from reliable partners. And I think that there's an awful lot we can be doing, certainly with Japan, as well as with Korea on that front.
Thank you for that. Yuho, as I look at Korea, from a layperson when it comes to nuclear energy industry, but I see a country that is very proud of the role that nuclear energy plays, the advanced nature of their R&D, their expertise. You went through KAIST, which is just a world-class organization. And a country that's had success in exporting and some pretty significant projects, but always kind of haunted, as it were, by the whole intellectual property dilemma. And I think, recently, finally, the Westinghouse standoff was resolved. And, if you could kind of touch on how you see the nuclear industry in Korea going forward, its biggest challenges, particularly in the fuel cycle arena, and any other insights you might have on the nature of U.S. ROK civil nuclear cooperation going forward.
Okay, I would like to start by reflecting how Korean nuclear industry has evolved and the critical role of the U.S. and the ROK alliance has played in that process. So South Korea's nuclear program was built on a strong partnership with the US starting in 1950s under the Atoms for Peace program. A defining moment came in 1962 when the US supplied Korea's first research reactor, Triga Mark II, at Seoul National University in 1962. So US institutions played pivotal roles in training Korean scientists and engineers, ensuring a highly skilled workforce in Korea. In the 1970s, as Korea developed a commercial nuclear power, US also remained a critical partner. The US firms like Westinghouse and Combustion Engineering transferred pressurized water reactor technology to Korea, enabling the country to build its first commercial reactor, Gori Unit 1, in 1978. And Korea then built on this foundation, localizing the technology and successfully advancing its own designs. and developing APR 1400 reactor, which is now deployed also outside Korea. So today, Korea operates 26 commercial nuclear power plants, supplying 30% of its electricity. So the UAE's Baraka's plant, powered by APR 1400, proved the Korea's ability to deliver nuclear projects on time and on budget, even outside Korea. So Korea is now expanding the nuclear partnership in Europe, as you know, including Poland, Czech Republic, and Romania. And the US support from the early technology transfer to strategic agreements was vital to the success of the nuclear energy program in Korea. And as Korea advances the next generation reactors, SMRs, and even fuel cycle innovations, US collaboration remains very critical to us. And now I think I can start answering your questions. So today I think the US and the Republic of Korea is entering a new phase. So for Korea, expanding nuclear exports beyond the domestic market has become essential. As the country's nuclear fleet is approaching its maximum capacity, with no realistic prospect of doubling the domestic nuclear fleet, looking abroad is not an option to us. It is a necessity for ensuring a future that surpasses the past. And the US, in the meantime, aims to, as far as I understand, aims to counter China and Russia, Russia's growing dominance in the global nuclear market, revitalizes its nuclear industry with the ambitious expansion plan on its nuclear fleets, and maintains its technological leadership. And I find that the exciting reality here is that these seemingly distinct national interests are not in conflict. In fact, they are highly synergistic, as Rose commented about, presenting new opportunities for deeper collaboration between our two countries. So I think that together the US and Korea can form a strong front against China and Russia, whose aggressive state-backed financing is actually eroding the Western nuclear market share. So the US has set an ambitious goal, as we are all aware of expanding its domestic nuclear fleet by adding 35 additional gigawatts of new capacity by 2035. However, achieving this goal requires addressing construction challenges that led to significant cost overruns we witnessed in Vogtle Unit 3 and 4. And I think the strategic engagement with the Korean nuclear industry could provide expertise and supply chain needed to avoid repeating the financial crisis of Vogtle Unit 3 and 4. So the one idea here from the blue sky idea is the construction of the APR 1400 reactors in the soil of the US, maybe. And a well-structured package deal, I think, could help the US regain confidence and reaffirms confidence in its nuclear expansion and incentivize Korean participation in US domestic nuclear projects at a competitive cost, while also driving further investments from Korea's automotive and semiconductor industries. So recent legal disputes between KHNP and Westinghouse have strained this alliance, I think, and creating challenges that ultimately play into the hands of China and Russia. So once the Westinghouse dispute is formally resolved, I think it is already quite well resolved by now, the partnership should not just return to its normal stage, but also expand to new heights. So U.S. ROK collaboration can also be a powerful force in winning upcoming nuclear export opportunities. With Korea's proven construction expertise and competitive supply chain, combined with the U.S.'s technological leadership and strategic influence, our partnership is well positioned, I think, to compete for and secure major nuclear projects in regions like Europe, the Middle East, and also Southeast Asia. So while Korea's nuclear phase-out policy is unlikely to return, I think it's my very personal perspective, the political dynamics of the Korea could create hesitation in domestic expansion. If a future administration is reluctant to push for nuclear growth at home while prioritizing exports, this bifurcation approach will not be very much sustainable. And long-term success requires a balanced strategy that strengthens both domestic and the international nuclear developments from Korea. So let me move to my final remark on the fuel supply side, very quick. So today, the Korea is the world's fifth largest operator of the nuclear power plants, following the U.S., China, Russia, and France. In terms of the amount of the electricity that nuclear power plants produce. So however, unlike these nations, Korea has no domestic uranium enrichment capability and relies entirely on foreign suppliers for its enriched uranium. And it is the only country that does that among these top five countries. So historically, this wasn't seen as a major issue in the past. So enriched uranium was abundant and affordable. However, the global landscape has changed. The Russian-Ukraine war has disrupted the uranium enrichment market, with the Western nations moving to phase out the Russian uranium, which accounted for about 40% of the world's supply. The prices surged by almost 50% or even more. And Korea, which operates 26 reactors without domestic enrichment, this creates a serious challenge for national security. Without domestic alternative, Korea remains uniquely vulnerable to these market fluctuations. In that regard, as much as exports matter for our collaboration, a closely tied issue is in the front-end fuel cycle. The reliable supply of enriched uranium, which is essential for sustaining and expanding Korea's nuclear industry. And Korea's planned nuclear expansion will only increase this demand, and according to our analysis, the enrichment cost for Korea's entire nuclear fleet, including the domestic ones, as well as the ones that we are building abroad, will sum up to about $1 billion annually for the enrichment only. And the reducing reliance on Russian uranium will not be easy without long-term and effective strategy. So to align with the U.S. policy banning Russian enriched uranium by 2028, Korea needs to secure stable and cost-effective supplies of LEU, low-enriched uranium, for existing nuclear fleets, and LEU plus and HALEU, which are basically the enrichment between 5 and 20% for advanced reactors, in cooperation with the US. This is where we need to actually take another look at that 2015 agreement for the cooperation in the peaceful use of the nuclear energy between the US and Korea. The agreement allows Korea to enrich technically below 20%, but only with the mutual consent through the high-level bilateral commission. And developing domestic enrichment capability via, for example, installation of the US enrichment facilities in the form of the black boxes, for example, wouldn't just strengthen the Koreans' energy security, it would also align with the US efforts to reduce the global dependence on Russian and the Chinese enrichment. So I think there are creative yet concrete ways to secure reliable nuclear fuel supply for Korea while also reducing global dependence on Russian and Chinese enrichment services. And I think a significant step was taken yesterday as Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power signed a 10-year enrichment contract with the Centros Energy backed by DOE. This marks the beginning of a deeper collaboration, taking our partnership in front-end fuel cycle to another level. But we can also aim even higher in the future. Looking ahead, the United States, Republic of Korea, and Japan have an opportunity to work together to establish a lasting solution for nuclear fuel supply security in East Asia region as a whole. So let me conclude my remark. So today, I think the US and Korea are not just allies, but we are the leaders shaping the future of global nuclear energy. And we must cherish and build upon our lasting partnership, using it as a foundation to disseminate clean, affordable nuclear energy worldwide. And by deepening this collaboration, I think we can contribute to providing global energy solutions while driving economic and technological benefits that directly serve the national interest, I think, of the both countries. And policymakers must recognize that our collaboration not conflict is the key to mutual success, and Korea needs the U.S. and the U.S. needs Korea. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. I remember vividly the 2015 round of negotiations, because we did really two major agreements at that time. One was the extension of the missile guidelines that allowed for longer-range missiles to be developed, given the reality of the growth of the North Korean nuclear program and the threat that was being posed. And then when we went into the 1, 2, 3, I think, on enrichment and reprocessing, we, just dug in our heels on that. And, time moves, and I think, the case that you've made about the disadvantages that the Republic of Korea has because of the agreement are well known. Do you think, what's the timeline for the next negotiation of that? And do you think this is an area where Korea can make its case and we might see from some movement from a more sympathetic Trump administration?
Yeah, so the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Korea is effective until 2035, as far as I know. But as you are very well aware of, this agreement, the preparation for the agreement can begin well in advance. And usually it starts about 5 to 6 years before the actual end day. So meaning that we are only left with, say, 3 or 4 years before we actually get to the tangible subject to discuss about. So I think we don't have too much time left. And at the same time, the last agreement that we made in 2015, right, actually allows us to have this high-level bilateral commission, which facilitates the discussion among the two countries anytime on any matter, including the enrichment and the reprocessing. However, this HLBC was opened for several times, but it is now no longer active today. So I think we can think about restarting this commission to formally start discussing about what we can do together on this matter, I think.
Yeah, I can see where it's going to be a little bit tricky because, we're sitting at a time where we know, according to CSIS polling and studies, that, that among the security elite, there isn't as strong a support for South Korea considering securing its own nuclear weapons capability. But nevertheless, it's hard to disagree that the topic is being discussed more than any time in the past, and the kind of push for ENR in a way that you make the case that it equals the playing field, particularly with parity vis-a-vis Japan, in the same sentence or in the same paragraph or even in the same paper as talking about the need to respond to North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal, makes it sound like the ENR objectives are to start carving a separate path when they're not. And so it's, that political handling of that under the new administration, I think will require a lot of wisdom. Yeah. So you look at the region, you've heard everything you talked about today, and we asked if you could talk a little bit about how this is all seen in Japan. So give us some wisdom.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sid. Little hard to tell you how it looks like from Japan, since I don't live in Japan, and certainly I do not. Former U.S. DOE. My perspective is very much as an outsider, but I've been following what's happening in Japan, as well as Korea and a couple other countries. But it's actually been quite an interesting past couple years in that following the 2011 earthquake and sort of Japanese nuclear energy industry and the system sort of coming to sort of a halt due to safety regulation updates and etc. I think in the past 2-3 years I've seen quite a remarkable sort of upswing, not just in some of the policy measures, but then also public opinion there. And before I get too much into the details, I think there's really a confluence of factors that is really starting to shift, I guess, the role of nuclear the way that Japanese policymakers see, and then also public is starting to appreciate. One is, the high and somewhat, volatile fossil fuel prices, not just because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but earlier, last decade, there was a lot of sort of both the dollar-yen balance, but then also generally, fossil fuel, the volume import became a lot higher. But then also there's this, I think Ross touched upon this just a little bit, but there are a lot of different end users that are starting to look at nuclear, hyperscale customers. There are all these AI and data center investments and interests in Japan that are starting to really re-energize interest in nuclear, particularly for countries, unlike the U.S., particularly for countries that do not necessarily have the wealth of hydrocarbons. Nuclear is still, with all the some paused assets, that's sort of could be a good solution. Then, of course, Japan is still committed to net zero, greenhouse gas reductions commitment. But quickly, so let's say February 2011, Japan had 54 operating units, supplying about a third of Japan's power supply. Fast forward, right at the moment, we've seen 14 units. I hope I'm not out of date, but I just kept checking to make sure I have the right numbers. But 14 units at 8 different plants, providing roughly 10%. Restart has been, probably slower than, some of us initially anticipated, but it has been happening gradually. There are also 3 units that are now back on under construction as well. But to really hit the type of decarbonization targets that Japan has, they still have to have, at least, I think 14 units, if I'm not mistaken, right now 14 units, but many more, at least double, if not probably close to tripling that capacity for nuclear to hit the share that Japan believes to be necessary to have zero carbon emitting power source to be part of its energy supply portfolio. Now, from the policy side, I think it was the 2020 Green Growth Strategy that actually mentioned that nuclear is one of the 14 different industries or sectors that could really help Japan, pursue both decarbonization, but then, I guess preserve its industrial competitiveness. But then also even fast forward, this green transformation strategy and all these laws that are coming out of Tokyo really are starting to put nuclear as much more of an asset as opposed to sort of political liability, if you will. This is completely my word. It's not out of the Japanese government document. But it's a really fascinating shift. And as a consequence, we've seen a couple different concrete developments. One is replacement. There's now support for having new units on the existing plants where, units are slated to be decommissioned, but those are the candidate sites for future reactors. Lifetime extension. Now, a reactor could operate beyond 60 years. There are a couple different, criteria they have to meet, but essentially units that have been put on pause, whether because of the regional, court decision, etc. Those years will not be basically units will not be penalized for the years that they had to stay inactive, and then also. And then I guess let me jump ahead because I do want to definitely have more conversation. But what's also very remarkable is that every 3 years the Japanese government releases strategic energy plan, and this coming fiscal year, starting in April, is when the 7th strategic energy plan is to go into effect. And based on the draft that the Japanese government has released, there's no longer I guess, commitment to, I guess, minimize the role of nuclear. Essentially, it's really just, recasting nuclear as, sort of an important piece. And in fact, I think, it just seeks to maximize the use as low carbon power supply. And, there's still a role for renewables, there's still a role for, natural gas, but, nuclear is very much part of on their menu. So just to tie it, go back to my initial comment, why is this happening? Because, when the sixth Strategic Energy Plan came out 3 years ago, the Japanese government and Japanese society was expecting quite a different sort of a landscape as far as power supply goes. They're actually expecting power consumption to remain low, and if not in the sort of downward slope. Now they're actually expecting power supply or power demand to go up because of data centers, because of AI. But then also, Japan is, still very much, looking to increase its greenhouse gas reductions target numbers. So right at the moment, it's a 46% reduction by 2030, but they're looking to increase that target to 60% reduction by 2035, and then even beyond, right? So so there's this huge, confluence of factors. And if I may, just quickly, I'm really very much looking forward to this conversation because I always thought that a nuclear is, really important part of the trilateral relationship, and I think Japan does have quite a engagement, continuing engagement, whether at the government to government or to some extent industry level. Japan, U.S, Japan, Korea, but I think Korea and Japan do have some similarities in some of the capabilities and capacities, and also sort of concerns, right? So how do you make it true, really trilateral, go beyond? It's not necessary to replace some of the existing bilaterals. I think those will remain to be very, very important. But to come up with the trilateral is, something that merits much more in-depth and frank discussion. On the commercial side, looking at the small modular, I think under the Biden administration, there was the first program that's the foundational infrastructure for, basically, promoting SMR in countries that could be new to nuclears, like Ghana. I think, U.S. and Japan has looked into Ghana as a potential country. But then also R&D side, I think there may be much more to be done, even potentially looking at what Japan is learning from, decommissioning, and that's a capacity, that's an expertise, and if it's, due to accident, that's very unfortunate. Hopefully no other countries necessarily have to go through that, but there's a lot of data that will, that's coming out, and I hope that could be a resource to the trilateral partnership.
So, what do you think on open to comments on the possibility of trilateral cooperation? What would be the priority projects and technologies and processes and projects that they could be focused on?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I guess a couple of things come to mind for me. One is getting back to fuel supply. So is there, and I don't have all the answers here, but is there something that we can be doing, and this might even be more than trilateral actually, right? It would include the United States, Japan, South Korea, probably some others as well. But how can we build a system that has more secure fuel supply for like-minded countries like ours? There's certainly things that we can be doing on the kind of R&D front, looking at some of these, technologies of tomorrow. But coming back to what I think is really important, which is let's focus on the technologies of today and how can we deploy them now. And so, we've had an era of commercial competition, I think, more so with the three countries. And I think there's an opportunity for more of commercial collaboration. Deal between KHNP and Westinghouse to resolve that conflict, I think is enormous. And that opens up what was a very contentious relationship, an opportunity to really collaborate. Looking at kind of the supply chains for the reactors that we're going to need to actually build, get steel in the ground, there's room to be working with our three countries to build that supply chain in a way that, again, you're not just talking about let's build a nuclear reactor and then maybe 20 years from now you start, digging with a shovel, but how can we actually get this moving now? And so I think there's some supply chain integration work that can be done there.
Ross mentioned the supply chain integration for this trilateral cooperation, and I think this is something that we can think of as a blue sky idea for sure. Like Jane said, like Korea and Japan share some similarities in many aspects, but also there are some distinctively different aspects in our capabilities in nuclear as well. So Korea has very well advanced light water reactor technology itself, but we don't have this enrichment and the reprocessing capabilities at all as compared to Japan. And that's something I think these two countries can be quite complementary to some extent when it comes to thinking about what we can do creatively for the reliable fuel supply system in the East Asia region as well. So I believe we can find some areas that we three countries can be quite complementary to each other, and then that's probably the region where the collaboration can start. Okay.
Yeah, if I can just comment real quick on the enrichment and reprocessing, and I think Yuho, I really liked how you focused on the front end of the fuel cycle in your comments, and I think that this is a potential, an area to look at, right? If we're talking about more nuclear energy, we're going to need more low-enriched uranium. There needs to be some enrichment, talking with our friends and allies about how to meet the demand for that, I think makes sense. That needs to be decoupled, I would argue, from reprocessing, which I don't think makes sense. There's really been 5 countries in the world that have embarked on large-scale reprocessing to date, and none of them have gone very well. So, I think certainly reprocessing presents major nonproliferation concerns, but even putting that aside for a moment, just looking at our goals in terms of cost-effective, rapid deployability for nuclear energy, I would run as far away from reprocessing as possible.
So what are the spent fuel challenges and solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing to understand is no matter what avenue you're looking at for waste management, there's going to need to be a permanent repository, right? Whether you're looking at directly disposing of spent fuel, as has long been the policy here in the United States, or if you were to go down the route of reprocessing, either way, you need a repository. So we can't think that reprocessing is somehow an answer to the nuclear waste problem. That's something that's been very politically difficult. No matter what path is chosen, we need to find solutions for how to do that. I would argue that it is a lot easier to dispose of spent fuel as one intact package, rather than if you're reprocessing, what this is you're chemically separating the spent fuel into its components. You're trying to recycle what can be recycled and then get rid of the stuff that can't be recycled. It's very messy, and it increases overall volume of waste. It's very complicated to deal with. And so, it's not easy either way, but it's still going to be a little easier if you go towards the direct disposal route.
On the topic of cooperating in international, nuclear commerce, I fully agree with Professor Lee. I think the competition arising from Russia, Russia is currently the leading exporter of nuclear technology. China today is, only has gotten Pakistan, but, there's definitely both the will and capacity to really become the next leader. So when it comes to, what the three countries, and perhaps as Ross said, maybe, and many other, some other like-minded countries ought to be really thinking more is maybe the financing side. The Development Finance Corporation of the United States government is up for reauthorization this year. Also, I think there's a lot of discussion around Export-Import Bank of the United States. What are some of the additional authorities that could that the Congress may provide to make them much more agile and competitive. Both Korea and then Japan have similar institutional and sort of institutional capacities. The Korea XM and et cetera. So there's probably room for more discussion on that front, not just sort of technology and R&D. Not to say that those are less important, but it could be more of a multifaceted, multi-frontier effort there.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think many of us who have spent the past few months answering the question, what will happen with Policy X under the new Trump administration? We have here the trilateral relationship being shown to the president. It is a package that looks like it's a major Joe Biden initiative, and therefore, no compelling need to follow it just for the sake of following it. Yet there's inherent reasons why we launched into trilateral energy, defense, nuclear cooperation, because it was seen as mutually beneficial to us. And I think it's just a matter of making the case. And, as we look in the coming weeks and months with a Japan-U.S. summit and South Korea, figuring out when they'll have an ability to engage at the leader level following the current impeachment process, there will be a time when these leaders talk about this issue. And I think some of the things that you've mentioned today would be significantly high to capture the attention and prove again why it's in the United States interest for this type of bilateral and trilateral civil nuclear cooperation. So we have a little bit of time left, looking for questions, 10 minutes according to the portable sign back there. Open to questions from the audience on any of the issues that we discussed today in the realm of civil nuclear cooperation.
Hello, my name is Irina Samuel and I work for CSIS, and there was a really great Energy Information Agency report that came out recently about how the United States is importing more uranium concentrate than in previous decades, and I was curious what South Korea's supply chain resilience strategies are as they rely only on uranium imports.
Yeah, so as far as I understood, you asked the landscape of the South Korea's uranium supplies, right? So, yeah, we import uranium from overseas, and we have to think differently for uranium ore from uranium enrichment. There are many places that supply uranium ores, so in terms of the energy security, it's not a big of the deal compared to the enrichment. So we import uranium from the typical major players like Kazakhstan and Australia, the countries that are not really politically too sensitive. But as for the enrichment, there are not many countries that do the enrichment for commercial scale. So we import the enrichment from the Orano and Urenco from the two major companies in the Western world, and also we import quite a bit of the uranium from Russia as well directly. So the U.S. announced the policy, or they actually passed this legislation in the Senate to ban the uranium import from Russia by 2028. That's probably because the U.S. is able to revive its enrichment capability through Centrus and all these new investments being made these days. But Korea is a little bit in a different situation. We are not in a very best position to just ban the enrichment from Russia, because we don't have capability to do so. So that's where we are at the moment. So to align with the U.S. national policy, or the direction of banning or reducing the Russian and Chinese uranium enrichment, I think we need to come up with some creative solutions to support that mission. So.
Yeah, well, that gets back once again to why you need to have the capability to enrich.
Yeah, but this capability can vary. It depends on how you see it, right? Like, it can be like very simple and easiest way to think of is that we have our capability to enrich, but that is one of the just the options that we can think of. I think there are many ways we can actually have that capability. Like what I said, we can let U.S. build their enrichment facility factories in the soil of Korea in the form of the black box, for instance. And that is like something that we are witnessing also in France. France has the enrichment facility, but the facility is run as the black box as well. So there are many creative ways that we can really start some constructive discussions about this without, any without this, this traditional concerns on this non-proliferation or these issues.
Okay. Hi, I'm a security student at GW, and from what I've learned, I used to work at an energy company in Japan, and from my understanding, one of the major barriers to increasing nuclear power in Japan is the opposition in local governments and local population in the areas they want to revive those nuclear units. So do you have any idea of how that can be resolved, or if there's any sign of that ever being resolved? And especially from the U.S. side, is there any way that can be help to change the public opinion?
Thanks for the question. I would imagine that the level and what's driving the local opposition probably varies from specific locality to another. Sometimes, communities that are hosting the power plant is not necessarily the user of that electricity. So it's not this. So there may be a sense of concern over what's fair, equity. Other times, the local community may see, employment benefits and different, much more local level economic benefits, and that may also really shape how they look at, the presence of any really actually industrial, massive industrial facilities, but certainly, nuclear is one that's, gets a lot of coverage, and for good reason, because I think, having seen the type of accident that causes a lot of dislocation in population, it's understandable. I think in a long, and by the way, so, even so the United States, it's hard to compare the two societies, but in any type of, sort of siting decision, I think it's very important to really just, keep, I think those that are interested in siting, they really need to listen what the local communities are saying, not just talking at them. And then often I think, the more you communicate, even if the solution is not perfect from where they started, where the local community started, I think that there could be the greater appreciation that they're views were heard and that you're part of the solution. During the Obama administration, the Blue Ribbon Commission, so the President Obama started the Blue Ribbon Commission to look at a lot of spent fuel, a lot of different aspects of the spent fuel management within the United States. And I saw in some of those, hearings, and it was really fascinating to hear, at so many different sort of local levels, efforts are done, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily unique to the U.S. or unique to Japan, and certainly not unique to nuclear. So that's sort of my answer to your question, and maybe Ross, you might have more insights into the U.S. side. And then by the way, and also, there, of course, it's a democratic country, so there, the local level judicial, rulings that may also affect the relationship between the operator and the community, but then also, the government. Whether it's prefectural government or it's the city level government. So it's quite complex, and I think I'd say it really varies from locality to locality. But at the same time, there's something to be said about, local engagement. You can't really skip that and ever expect anything that's viable and sustained solution.
Yeah, just I guess in the United States, what I think we generally see is that nuclear power plants generally enjoy pretty solid support because they, this is my opinion, I guess, but they create lots of jobs and good jobs, and they're important for the community. And this is where I think spent fuel management, waste management can become really tricky because you need these facilities for spent fuel management. They don't come along with the same number of jobs that you would have with a nuclear power facility. And so I think there's room for bargaining here in terms of how you can make this all work together. But it's an interesting question because it brings up this issue about some nuclear facilities do get a lot of support and others don't.
Well, again, going back to the lunchtime presentation by Senator Sullivan, the shift that has come under the Trump administration in the fossil fuel domain is just a reminder of how quickly these winds can change. And on the nuclear side, I don't know if we'll ever get a point where people welcome nuclear reactors in their backyard. There'll always be a NIMBY challenge we have to face. There'll always be disinformation. There'll always be loud opponents. There'll always be those who will fight to the end. And then you drive up to a town that has a power plant, and like you said, they're appreciative of the jobs provided. They're comfortable with the safety. Whether it's water discharge, hopefully not fuel discharge, water discharge or other elements of it. But it's tough this is a difficult industry that has to navigate these winds of change. And we talked about things. What struck me is that there's nothing on the horizon that represents a technological breakthrough that people are going to have that aha moment. These things are safe. This is not 3 Mile Island. This is not Chernobyl. It's not Fukushima, that this is a much safer, much more reliable. And the pace in Japan is pretty slow when you think about it. I did not realize those numbers were so low for restarting those reactors. But, it's an industry that has endured a lot of this before and just will need to kind of, do the right messaging and the right PR to kind of restore the integrity of the energy source, the industry, as it were. And you can see where, again, since the topic of our discussion was trilateral, bilateral, civil nuclear cooperation, why our countries can work together toward that end. So thank you for that question. I think it's a good question to end today's session on. And thank you to all the panelists. Really learned a lot today. I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon.
So before closing, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This conference, Resilient Allied Energy Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, I think it really was a timely event for all of us to understand the Trump administration new energy policy, and also where the Trilateral cooperation is, and also allowing us to actually explore new areas of strategic energy cooperation and ways to work for the future cooperation. I think there were many things that we could take away from today's discussion, and hopefully we can continue that discussion as well. In closing, I want to thank Korea Foundation for sponsoring this event. I want to thank Senator Sullivan, Representative Armin Bera, Chairman Terazawa, and all other speakers for their time and participation. We have 3 international speakers coming from Japan and Korea, so really appreciate that despite their jet lag right now. Finally, big thanks goes to the CSIS team, Korea Chair, Congressional team, and also the AV and Congress team. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone in this room and also those joining us online. Stay engaged with the Korea Chair, and we look forward to meeting you in the future event. Thank you.